Waiting for the stream to catch up. Hey, we're good. Okay. So, uh, real quick, this is going to be a longer section. There's about 20 pages in this chapter, so I'm going to try to jump into it fairly quickly. Recapping from chapter 1, Trem Waterhound, our protagonist, found another young man, also half human and half elven, dying in the woods near his home, brought him back to his home, and has since patched him up and begun uncovering sort of why this other half elf, Joven, um, was in the woods in the first place. And it turns out that Joven's looking for his father, who's been not missing necessarily, but out of contact for a while. So we're going to jump in from there. And chapter 2's got a number of different sections. I'll probably take breaks just to make sure that I'm coherently speaking. And I will do the Q&A at the end. And I will also talk about the YouTube channel, which is going to have all of these videos stored up there. You'll probably also notice real quick, I am now in this studio space that I'm still working on. It's not anywhere near where I want it to be in terms of being set up. So I'm kind of changing the angle of the video and all that stuff. If you're somebody watching and you find the angle or presentation of the stream distracting, just put something in chat. I'll try to adjust at the end of a section if I can. The only other thing is to remind you that you can buy both books, The Sword and the sequel, The Shield, on Amazon.com. If you search for T.H. Paul and The Legacy Chronicle, which is the name of the series, you can also follow me at Legacy Chronicle on Twitter. All right, so chapter 2. Trem entered the wood quietly and with a determined step. The tea had invigorated him slightly, and his sharp eyes felt a renewed focus, making this a good time to go hunting. He tried to dismiss the idea that it was also a welcome reprieve from conversation with Jovanaleth, but the thought lingered. He liked Joven, found him to be sincere and stubborn, qualities Trem liked to believe he possessed as well. But he was still an outsider, even if he was half-elven like Trem. There was no room in Trem's little corner of the world for others, and it would be better once he was gone. Dressed in rough leather breeches, a dark green tunic, and a long strap from shoulder to hip that held a water flask, Trem paused to adjust his outfit and ensure nothing was shifting or moving loosely from his body. His dirty blonde hair, shoulder-length and wavy, was tied back with the silk cords which did not affect his vision. He touched his curved bow slung over his shoulder and recounted the quiver of arrows to be certain he had enough. Satisfied, he continued to pace steadily forward, putting distance between himself and his home in hopes of stumbling across a deer trail. He was not far from the cabin, perhaps half a mile when he came across one. Trem could vividly recall his parents' home from years ago and the hunting expeditions with his father. The trail was fresh. Trem could see the bent and broken stems of plants from a recent passing deer. His father's voice echoed in his head. Look for the hoof prints, find the direction they point, and then follow them. It's not so difficult. A small, insistent voice in the back of his mind kept trying to intercede with a pragmatic tone, but he wasn't your father, not really. Trem quickened his pace and put his mind to work on the hunt. This place had reminded him of that time when he was young, before he learned his beloved parents were not really his true mother and father. Did it matter? He'd been happy then, content to live a life of solitude and hard-won prosperity with a quiet and honest pair of herders. Trem had felt he belonged in that place, like he belonged in Silverleaf now, and that was all that mattered. The creeping doubts and anger had to be ignored. They would bring him no solace or peace. Trem did not know why he chose this particular path, but the trail pulled him onward. He paused briefly to consider his position. He was certain that he was close to his quarry, but he could hear nothing that verified his suspicions. A deer could be quiet, but they were not invisible. Trem raised his head from the tracks he had knelt to examine. Scanning the trail in front of him, he spotted a large buck behind a broad tree trunk, grazing on low plants. For a moment, Trem was simply in awe. The animal was magnificent, massive full antlers and a strong, sinewy body with a symmetrical and curving pattern of tan and brown fur. For a time, Trem just watched it, caught in the incredible splendor of the animal. Then he quietly removed his bow and strung it, notching an arrow as he made ready to aim. Nothing he had done was loud enough to alert the most on guard of animals, but the deer turned and looked right into his eyes as he touched arrow to string. Then it bounded off through the trees, cutting hard into the left. Trem swung around the curve, hoping to get a quick shot in before it found shelter behind another trunk. He paused in confusion, for the deer was standing just beyond where it had turned, waiting and watching. Again, as Trem raised his bow, the creature darted ahead of him. Trem chased it onward, and the pattern repeated itself over and over. Always the beast was one step ahead of him, but close enough that the hunter would not give up his pursuit. For hours the game went on. Sweat poured down Trem's face and soaked his body. The bow began to feel heavy in his hands, and his pace slowed ever so slightly. The deer was always waiting, always patient. Trem refused to give in and followed it relentlessly. As his exhaustion began to take over, he saw the buck leap out from the tree cover to his right and break into a small raised clearing. Calling all his reserves into play, Trem raced after it. and stopped at the clearing's edge, thinking he could hit the animal easily in such an open space. But the deer was nowhere in sight. Trem stood dazed on the edge of the clearing, unable to believe his eyes. It was a small hillock that rose sharply, but for only a brief distance. He could see the edge of the forest on all sides. Not only was his prize gone, the whole area seemed barren of animal life. Yet from the center of a small rise, stretching high into the air like a tower or a pillar, was a massive tree. Trem recognized its black and sinuous curving trunk and silver leaves that resembled steel almost immediately. This was a soul tree. The dark, oily roots covered the hill it rested on, and Trem suspected the girth was so great they had repelled all other growth and propelled the great tree upward to form the mound it now stood watch over. Soul trees were believed to exist only in the forester homeland. When great elves died, they were buried in the soul groves, dedicated plots of land where ancestors were laid to rest. There they sprouted a strange sapling of dark wood black as night and grew to their full size in a matter of days. The height and width of a soul tree was determined by the power of the deceased and the reverence in which the foresters and gods held them. For one to have grown so large as this, as those Trem had seen had only reached the heights of elves or men, it had to have been a legendary figure. But this place was far from any settlement of the foresters, east of Drena Outpost by nearly 100 miles. Who could possibly have fallen and been buried here? Trem approached the giant curving trunk, his hands caressing the black bark that was smooth as glass to the touch. He thought he could feel the steady swell and recession of breath in the tree, but knew that to be impossible. The leaves glimmered and shone about him, reflecting in the sinking sunlight like 1,000 tiny mirrors. Trem strode slowly and carefully, aiming to avoid stepping on root or branch out of respect. He searched for some indication of who might be buried here, longing to know. He had nearly completed his circumvention of the great trunk when a voice, old and beyond reckoning and powerful, echoed in his mind. You are not a god. Trem stumbled slightly, nearly falling, but a low branch seemed to swing suddenly behind him and stop his tumble. He recovered quickly and looked around in fear, his bow in his hand, without hesitation or thought. Before he could set the arrow, the voice reverberated in his head once more. Put your bow down, huntsman. I'm not going to harm you. Trem turned and faced the tree, for what else could it be that was speaking to him? The branches wavered slightly. It might have been only the breeze, and the air was quiet all around him. Unsure of what else to do, Trem spoke aloud. No, I am not a god. I'm Trem Waterhound, a simple hermit. Boy, the voice fairly thundered in his brain. Do not try to play games with me. I am far too old to be toyed with. You may not be a god, but there is a part of one within you. I can feel it, felt it from far off, and therefore claiming to be a hermit is a foul lie I will not listen to. Trem breathed slowly, trying to calm himself. He lowered his bow and ran a hand through his hair. How can you know these things about me? Trem was not certain a tree could chuckle, but that was the sensation he felt come back from the being before him. How? Why, my child, I've known many mortals. In my life I was a druid of great power, no stranger to the ways of gods, and a loyal servant to the goddess Lorima herself. I can sense the peace of one in you, and that is not something I have ever felt before. So faint, but burning so brightly. I wish to know why you have this gift over others. Trem's lip curled slightly in a smoldering anger. I don't think gift is the proper term. I did not ask to be what I am. That is no different than most. It's just your circumstances are far more unusual than others. Trem attempted to redirect the conversation. I also would ask something of you. I have seen soul trees before, but never one of such majesty. I gave you my name. I would ask for yours in return. A fair request. In life, I was called Garand Oakheart. Trem's jaw dropped despite himself. Grandfather Forrest. So this is where you finally fell. Fell. Yes, I suppose I did. Coldren Baron brought me here, and he left me at my insistence. I don't recall falling or dying, only a great weariness overtaking me, and then I was awake, but no longer the same. I could feel the forest all about me, the resonance of Silverleaf and the light of 1,000 lives in plant and animal swirling in an endless spiral outward. It was wondrous, and it remains so. Though I must admit, I have missed the conversation one has with others. Squirrels and other rodents are too scatterbrained to talk with, and the other wiser beasts hold me in such reverence it's almost as though they fear to talk in anything but formalities. Trem listened in fascination to the breezy voice in his mind, pacing slowly about the great roots while looking up at the full stateliness of the tree about him. This was a great discovery he had made, and one he did not feel worthy to have been in the presence of. Garen's spirit spoke again. How is it that you, Trem Waterhound, who carries part of a god, found me when others did not? Did your divine spark bring you here? No, Trem answered. I was hunting a deer. It burst through the wood in this clearing, and I followed. I sensed no such animal. Strange. Trem did not respond. His mind raced with things to ask, but he could not settle on one question. The voice echoed about him once more. Why do you call yourself a hermit, Trem Waterhound? Because I am. I live alone in Silverleaf, or at least I have been alone until recently. Oh? Trem, for lack of anything else to say, explained the discovery and recuperation of Javanaleth to Geraint Oakheart. The strange and otherworldly voice did not interrupt him, nor could Trem be certain he was still listening, but he told what tale there was anyway. And so, once he is well enough, I will lead him back to the road and wish him luck. Then it will be me and me alone once again. There was a lingering silence. Then Grandfather Forrest said, Why leave him? This is a young man of similar lineage, whom you admit reminds you of yourself, in need of aid. I sense you have reason to be alone, Trem Waterhound, but does no part of you retain a love and concern for your fellow mortals? Do you not miss them? Even I, who have died and become something more than I once was, relish the sound of another's voice. He's no one to me, Trem insisted, averting his eyes from the great tree. He's just a man in distress that I helped. He has told me little and kept much of his quest hidden. I do not believe he wants my help, and I'm content to see him on his way. Perhaps he would be more willing to share his tale with you if you were more forthcoming about yourself. Trem waved his hand in violent dismissal. There's nothing in my past that would encourage trust. Quite the opposite, and that is why I remain in Silverleaf. I'm better off alone, and the world gets on quite well without me. Youth, the voice breathed, so angry and righteous all at once. I remember it faintly. Do you think I do not detect the lies in your voice? Your words may be true, or you have convinced yourself they are, but behind them lies doubt. Trem was unsure of how to respond, so he let the comment hang. The spirit of Geraint Oakheart continued. Do you know my tale, Trem Waterhound? I heard it many times, Grandfather Forrest. You're a legend, a great hero to all the people of Lagoshe, even Teth Tanir and Tyre. But you have heard the story, then, the recounting of events and the actions taken or not taken. You've not heard of friendship, the love, the sacrifice, and all the sadness that came with it. Those are the things few but the greatest bards can relate, and even they pale in comparison to the experience itself. You are right. I've not heard the tale in such depth. It's too long to recount here and now, and I suspect you would have little patience for it, but there is one part that I believe might be of use to you. Coldren Baron was commander of the Eagle Knights when the Arcane Wars began. He was a reasonable man, a practical one, and had he not been their leader, I doubt any other would have accepted my offer of aid, or that of the Silverleaf Elves. We fought that war together, a human and an elf, side by side, despite the countless feuds and wars our own people had held against one another before. I did not want to help him at first, and I suspect he would have refused my help if he had believed he could, but I was commanded by the goddess Lorima to seek him out, in visions of what would come if I did not. That alliance, formed of necessity, killed me in the end. The terrible forces we contended with infested me with their power, and tried for a long time to consume me in their indescribable madness. I knew I was dying, knew it was killing me not to give in, not to succumb to the thing that had taken up residence in my body. Coldren knew it too. And when his own men betrayed him and took back the knights, returning them to an institution of hatred and segregation, he and those loyal to him stayed with me. When I could no longer continue on, he and he alone walked me into Silverleaf, and was my sole companion before death. A man whom my people would have called their enemy not long before was, at the last, my only friend. Trem was quiet as the voice swirled around him in tones of sadness tinged with love and longing. He did not speak for a time, then replied carefully, Your sacrifice is well known, Grandfather Forrest, but perhaps not all of us are as brave as you, or as willing to risk the hope that others will return our loyalty one day. You must understand me, Trem Waterhound. There was no bravery, not even in the end. There was only the task that needed doing, and the determination to see it done. Coldren and I became friends not because we were similar, but because we had walked hand in hand to stand against a foe as one. Why must you and Javanaleth be any different? Trem shook his head fiercely. It's not the same. I've stood, as you said, hand in hand against a common foe with others different from me, and then, when the enemy had fallen and we two fell on one another, it was the same old feuds. What feud exists between you and Javanaleth? Trem had no answer, though he feebly sought for one. Grandfather Forrest continued. Perhaps you're right, Trem Waterhound. Perhaps you and Javanaleth will not form a bond, will not rise above mere acquaintance or to something better, but you and your life of solitude will not sustain you. Trem laughed aloud. I think you're lacking an important piece of knowledge. The piece of an immortal within me is what sustains me. I carry a part of Curvin, the god of time. I don't grow older. For me, time itself stands still. He held his hands outstretched in mock invitation to his own grandeur. I am the persistence of life itself. That is not life. That's merely a continuation of existence. The voice was harsh and scornful. Time is not what measures your life, Trem Waterhound. It is what you do with whatever time you have. You could have lived 1,000 years alone here in Silverleaf, and a child of 10 might have surpassed you in living many times over. Trem was growing frustrated, but he restrained himself from responding out of respect. The voice had stopped and silence reigned for a time, enough so that Trem was able to grow calmer and consider what Garand Oakheart had told him. At last the half-elf shouldered his bow and bowed slightly. I will take your wisdom into account, Grandfather Forest. Perhaps I will return soon and inform you of my decision. Farewell, Trem Waterhound. I have enjoyed speaking to you, though I do hope if we converse again, it is after you've dared to leave this place and tried to live once more. Trem turned sharply and walked out of the clearing. He reached the cover of the trees and realized it was growing quite dark. He had found no food for the next day and was beyond the point where the hunting would be likely to prove fruitful. He walked slowly through the forest, deep in thought after the strange encounter only moments before. He turned to look back before he was too far into the wood, and could not see the hillock or the opening any longer, though he was sure it should have still been visible. Without pausing to consider the bizarre occurrence any longer, he began loping across the forest floor back to the cottage. The snares he had set earlier that day would have to suffice for now, and he did not wish to leave Javanaleth alone for much longer. Section break. Just double checking that I'm not missing something important here. Okay. Alright. The bright, late morning sunlight came through the thin animal hide window, and Javanaleth woke slowly. He had no recollection of falling asleep or of coming into the cottage. His surroundings were strange to him, and at first he did not remember where he was. Once his memory returned, he noted he was feeling more revived and strong than he had since his injury. Leaning on the edge of the bed, he looked out into the opposite room to see if his companion was present. Seeing nothing, he decided to try and stand. Tossing aside the patched sheets, he slowly leaned onto his feet. Testing his legs, Jovan wobbled slightly, then steadied. He walked a few shaky steps and then, having found his rhythm, discovered he could walk outside, slowly, but pain-free. Well, you are looking better. Trem had been awake for some time. Jovan turned quickly at the sound of his voice and saw the hermit coming from the woods with 3 more freshly snared rabbits. He smiled and said, "And feeling much better. Thank you." Trem nodded to indicate he had heard Javanaleth, but his expression did not change. He sat at the fire pit and began to butcher the freshly caught meat. Jovan walked slowly over to his host and eased himself down on the same log he had used the day before. Trem continued with his task mechanically, and neither of them spoke. Trem finished skinning the last rabbit and squatted down to begin selecting a spit from the iron skewers next to the pit. Jovan finally felt compelled to break the silence. "I think I should leave here tomorrow." Trem did not answer right away, though he paused in his work. "Are you sure you're well enough?" Javanaleth shrugged. "As well as I can expect, and delays are costly at this point." "Where exactly do you intend to go next?" "Gailakill," Jovan responded decisively. "It was our destination before, and there is no reason to change course from the original plan. It is a place for travelers from across the land, and if there is any news or rumor of my father, I can think of no better place to begin asking after it." Trem looked up from the fire. "Your last attempt to cross the Dust Plains landed you, bleeding and feverish, in these woods. It was a miracle I found you before an opportunistic predator, or even found you at all. So now you intend to take up your task, which nearly killed you, without the aid of your friends." Jovan's face darkened significantly. "I have no choice. My father's missing, and I must find him. I don't expect you to understand." Surprisingly, Trem's face softened somewhat, and he turned back to the fire. "No, I do understand, Javanaleth. Better than you might expect, in fact. I'll take you to the road tomorrow, and from there you can make your way to Gailakill." He stood, the 3 rabbits now slowly roasting over the fire. "Watch them while I see what I have left for vegetables." Javanaleth was unsure how to respond, so he did not. He kept the spits turning slowly, cooking the meat evenly, while Trem scraped together a mixture of carrots and beets he thought were still edible. The 2 ate shortly afterwards in silence, and then Trem stood. "If you must leave tomorrow, you will need supplies, and I have few to spare. I will attempt hunting once again, and I will be gone for much of the day. There is some food left inside, and you're welcome to it. If I am fortunate, I will have much more when I return." Without any further discussion or opportunity for thanks, Trem strode to the cottage, retrieved his bow and quiver from the day before, and left. Javanaleth spent much of the day sitting at the fire, making slow, stiff walks to the rain barrel and other places around the cottage. He ventured a bit further into the tree line once or twice, but wisely chose to go no further. Finally, he settled on trying to heft his broadsword again. He was able to raise it painfully, but he could manage only a few feeble and awkward swings. His strength was back, but the wound in his side was still tender and the muscles around it not yet fully healed. Dejected and slightly bored, he sat down by the fire again with the blade in his lap, to wait and waited for Trem to return. Though he had said he was going hunting, and intended to do so, Trem spent the better part of the morning and early afternoon searching for the deer trail that had led him to Garand Oakhart's soul tree. But there was no trace, and he could find anywhere near where he had stalked the quarry the day before. He then attempted to orient himself back based on things he had seen that day, and from memory construct a pathway to where the hillock had been, but it was no use. After several hours of frustration, he was still no closer to finding his way than when he had started. He set himself down in the gap between the tree's roots and rested for a time, listening to the birds and other small residents of the forest all about him. The thought of leaving had remained deep in his mind all day, and now sitting here he thought to himself, why should he? Here there was peace and relative quiet. No one bothered him, and he bothered no one. He had come here for a reason, a very serious and important reason, many years before, had he not? Surely Javaneleth's arrival and dire situation did not change anything for Trem. After all, he had already done more than was necessary in healing him and allowing him a safe place to recover. Trem owed Javaneleth nothing, and he was certain the young man would see it that way as well. But the words of Garand Oakhart still lingered in his head. That sad, sympathetic tone when he had lamented Trem's bitter isolation and fear of the outside world. That is not life. Those had been his words. Trem had dismissed them in earnest before, but now he began to wonder. His search had been in vain, and it frustrated him, for in talking to Grandfather Forrest once again, he had hoped to come to some clear-minded decision, instead of the mire of confusion he found himself in now. The simple answer was to do what he had told Javaneleth he would, and nothing more or less. However, another part of Trem, one long suppressed, seemed to be growing in strength and command. Trem stood and brushed dirt from his clothes. There was an alternative to finding Grandfather Forrest here, of course, one that he did not relish but felt might be necessary. He sighed audibly and shook his head in almost disbelief at his own conclusions. This would likely not be a pleasant experience. Trem set his mind to hunting for now, and tried to forget the looming challenge he would face later. Javaneleth was still awake when Trem returned to the cabin. It was a good sign. It meant Jovan's strength was returning along with his stamina. The journey would still be long and difficult, but it seemed Jovan might be better able to complete it than Trem had expected. The hunter came from the brush with a large doe slung over his shoulder. Jovan stood and made as though to come and help him, but Trem waved him back. Walking past the cabin, he tied a rope around the creature's back legs and strung it up. He looked back at his guest and smiled. More food than we'll need for a while, but good timing. You can take most of the meat with you once it's been cooked. Can you help me? The job goes faster with 2 pairs of hands. Jovan was happy to have something to do. Moreover, Trem made him feel useful by giving him actual responsibility in the process. Rather than gutting the creature himself, which Javaneleth expected would have been swift and efficient, the half-elf showed his guest where to cut and how deeply. Javaneleth had hunted before, but to his shame the butchering of his kills had always been handled by servants or professionals paid for the service. This was a new experience, and Jovan was happy for anything to do other than sit and wait. It took them a little over an hour to completely skin the deer and remove the organs. Trem set some aside to boil into a soup, a practice Javaneleth was unfamiliar with, and not a little nauseous at the prospect of. Noting his companion's discomfort, Trem proclaimed they would eat the soup that very evening, ostensibly to prove to Javaneleth it was a far better meal than the sight of the innards might imply. Jovan was just able to avoid retching at the idea. They spent the rest of the evening cooking, setting the animal skin to dry, and brewing more tea to enjoy while they worked. Trem chopped more kindling, as they had run low, and Javaneleth was left to watch the food and rotate various items over the fire. It was an efficient and comfortable system, and the two talked more than they had in any of the previous days combined. Trem spoke of various hunting escapades he'd been on, most in Silverleaf, but some near his family's home, a place he described in such general terms Javaneleth could not place it. Jovan talked of his home and family a bit, but mostly the city itself and the various places he liked to visit. Trem discovered he had read a great deal more than Javaneleth, who seemed to take knowledge from people rather than texts. A good-natured argument soon arose over which was the more valuable form of scholarship, a debate that remained happily unresolved when they were done. Javaneleth finally went to bed well after the sun had gone down, though he was resolute in stating he wanted to arise early and be on his way as soon as possible. Trem grew quieter as he prepared to leave, and Javaneleth was on the verge of thanking him profusely for all he'd done when he sensed this was not the time. With a slight nod, he turned and made his way gingerly into the cabin and to bed, where he was soon sleeping deeply. For his part, Trem made himself comfortable by the fire and allowed his thoughts to drift slightly, but kept meditating on a singular purpose. He needed to walk a fine line between freely letting his mind wander and priming himself for what lay ahead. As he gradually began to drift into sleep, his heart rate slowing and his breath coming more steadily and more rhythmically, he reminded himself that he was in control and would remain so. When the calm of true unconsciousness took him, it did not have him fully in its power, and Trem was able to slowly peel back the curtain and assume command of his dreams. It is impossible to know how long one sleeps before they begin to dream, as it can vary depending upon their need for deeper sleep and personal tendencies toward dreams. Regardless, the arrival of a dream always feels sudden to the sleeper, as the time before when we are unconscious passes without any notion of it having done so. As Trem felt the dreamscape forming around him, he could not be sure how long he'd been sleeping before it took him, or how long it would be before he would awaken. Time between the realm of mortals and the realm of dreams does not synchronize, and one can never know how long has passed in the waking world whilst they are asleep. Thus, someone who takes control over their dreaming self never knows how long they have in the dreamscape, making the possibility of completing any task in a single sleeping period a difficult calculation. Trem knew that those who worshipped one of the lesser mortals, Morphus, god of dreams, often used various methods, both magical and medicinal, to extend their sleeping period. These were dangerous and often unpredictable, and he never dared to try any of them himself. Moreover, he was not a trained dreamwalker, just someone who had slowly developed an understanding that he could take control of himself and his surroundings when dreaming, and manipulate them. Trem had heard a great deal in his youth, and understood that control over one's dreams was something that could be practiced and expanded, but often took many years of active attempts to even become marginally successful at it. For him it had been a skill he had from birth, likely an extension of his power from holding a part of a god within him, and one that he detested just as often as he found it useful. Now with the dreamscape fully formed before him, Trem concentrated on a familiar place, his own cabin. The scene shifted and reformed to replicate it, though of course it was not precisely the same. One of the great difficulties of controlling and traveling through the dreamscape is that everything in the dreamer's mind appears normal, even those things which are impossible in the mortal world. This is believed to be because the dream world exists between the mortal realm and the godly realms. In the mortal realm there are physical laws that dictate what is possible, and those limitations build expectations in the minds of mortal people, so that anything behaving in defiance of those laws is noteworthy and perhaps even frightening. In the godly realms there are no such physical laws, at least according to what Trem understood from his studies. The gods can create the illusion of physical space or limitations, form bodies and objects that mimic those on Teth Tanir, but they are unnecessary trappings, audacious lies the gods tell themselves and the rare mortal who might visit them. In the godly realms, only the power of the god and the scope of their imagination and wisdom set limits on their world, and the dreamscape is a strange amalgamation of the two. When you see a fish float by you in the air, as you stand amid the hot sands of a desert, you do not question its possibility in a dream, though were you awake, you would believe you had gone insane. This is the wonder and the danger of the dreamscape, for we may accept the normality of things that can harm us in the strange intersection of mortal and immortal planes. Trem allowed the scene before him to fill with familiar objects and sights, helping him create more stability and grounding him in the dreaming realm. Once he felt he'd established his presence there strongly enough, he began to consider how he could reach out to Garand Oakheart. The dead of Teth Tanir were taken to the godly realms by Naroth, as was his duty, and there ensconced in worlds born of their own memory and experience, or, if they had been especially pious, placed with the deity to whom they were dedicated. Once dead, a mortal was able to shape their world just like a god did, though awareness of their state and raw power greatly limited the changes they could bring. More importantly, the dead could reach the dream world with relative ease, simply by choosing to, as sleep was not a necessity for the dead. But Trem was faced with an unusual challenge. Garand Oakheart had died, and his soul had given birth to a great tree, as the sacred right of the Silverleaf Elves decreed was possible. Was he then dead and able to traverse the dreamscape as easily as those in the godly realms? Was he trapped within the soul tree, and the method of reaching him different? Trem did not know, and it occurred to him that if the latter were true, it would soon be evident when he tried to make contact with the spirit of the dead man. In his mind, he steeled himself and began to try to form the hillock and clearing where he had previously met Grandfather Forrest. As it was a place less familiar to him, the images about him shimmered and shifted with some regularity, much less stable than the cabin. Trem pressed onward, attempting to pull from his memory the precise appearance of the place and, in particular, the gnarled roots of the tree and its great trunk rising into the air, believing this part of the image would be most necessary to summoning the entity that he sought. The image was still slipping from one sight to another, but Trem felt the appearance of a presence. He eased his attention on the environment slightly and spoke. "Grandfather Forrest, is that you? I am Trem Waterhound, the hunter who stumbled across your tree. I have questions I would ask." The voice hummed in Trem's mind as before, but he knew immediately it was not that of Garand Oakheart. "I can answer your questions, Trem Waterhound." The arrival of a being Trem had not sought disturbed him, for it meant the other presence had been seeking him and was strong enough to have not only found him, but also to have brought itself to his location in the dream world. Trem's reply was wary. "You're not Grandfather Forrest." "No, I am Curvin, god of time, and perhaps of more assistance to you than the one you seek." As the voice pulsed steadily and unabating in Trem's mind, the form of the speaker emerged before him. Curvin was shapeless, though he seemed to have done Trem the favor of forming shades of blue in the shape and placement of eyes. It was only mildly less unnerving. The god spoke again. You may ask your questions. Trem was unsure why, but he relinquished control of the dreamscape to the other, and it lurched violently to another place. The world swam around them and reformed swiftly. They floated in space, surrounded on all sides by stars, wonderful and bright. Trem, despite his understanding that it was a dream, looked about himself agape. Curvin did not seem surprised or even fazed by the sudden relocation. Instead, he waited for Trem to collect himself. Despite his wonder, the half-elf was still cautious. I am not sure you are the one I wish to ask anything of, God of Time. I have what you gave me, unasked for, and I think you've done enough. Trem's tone was confrontational, though he tried to keep it level and even. Curvin's reply came in the same strange, pulsing rhythms. That is a matter which cannot be undone, though if you wish to know more of it, I will try to answer you. My questions were for Garand Oakhart, not you. But I am here, and he is not, nor will you be able to reach him unless he wills it, and he does not. He believes he has told you all you must know, and he has gone back to his meditation with the wood, earth, stone, wind, and rain of Silverleaf Forest. I see. Trem thought for a moment. After all, he could simply abandon the dream world and awaken, or go into a black, empty sleep and forget this exchange. Still, his curiosity got the better of him. Why did you come to this place? Was that what you were going to ask, Grandfather Forest? Trem detected a hint of amusement in the response. Of course not, but you're here now, and the answer interests me. Very well. You have not attempted to control the dreaming world for some time. As you said, I gave you something long ago when you were born, and that piece of me still holds a connection to my greater self. I sensed you here, and the tendrils of need sent in search of another. I interceded, knowing you'd fail in your task, to see if I could be of aid to you. Now you choose to see if you can help me? After all the times before, Curvin cut him off. The gods can no longer intervene whenever we please, nor make contact under circumstances of our choosing. You know this, as you also know that you could have sought me in any of my temples or in this realm where we are now, having this discussion. Do not blame me for your decision to hide yourself away. For that, Trem had no answer. He knew Curvin was correct. He had reached out to him, or had he reached out to him, or quite likely any god, he would have answered. Still, he refused to be cordial. You're right. I do not want to speak with you or any of your kind. I've hidden and would choose to remain so. But you have doubts. Doubts brought on by your new guest and a surprise conversation with a revered druid, long dead. How did you know about Javanaleth? I cannot interfere with your life or enter your world, but I can observe, and what we share makes it easier to find and watch you. How comforting, Trem scowled. Maybe my first question ought to be how to keep you from looking in on me. It's not something I do often, only when events pique my interest. Trem did not answer. He scanned the stars all about them and wondered to himself if there was any reason to continue this conversation, again considering if leaving the dreamscape was the better course of action. He could go back, sleep, awaken, and then see Javanaleth on his way and return to his former life. But the same internal confusion that had led him to this course of action still lingered. With a sigh, he asked, What truth is there in what Garand Oakhart said, that by remaining as I am now, I'm not truly living? Curvin was slow in responding. As I am immortal, I do not know if I understand the meaning of the question. Trem rolled his eyes in frustration, but Curvin was not done. Though I suspect he means living in the sense of experience. What have you not already done and learned from Silverleaf, from a lonely life? What is left for you if you stay there? It's not what is left, but what awaits me if I leave that's kept me where I am for so long, Trem answered. If you have truly watched me, then you understand. Outside of Silverleaf, among the others, I have not had great fortune. I see, Curvin said. So your past failures are sure your future will bring more of the same. I do not do well among others, as I said. You seem to have enjoyed the company of Javanaleth. Maybe I'm just good with individuals. Add more, and Trem trailed off, unwilling to elaborate. Perhaps I'm not so knowledgeable of social matters among your kind. Is it not one of your powers to see the future? Trem asked. As the god of time, couldn't you tell me what would happen if I go or if I remain? Time is not a straight line, nor does it have singular events that, like rungs on a ladder, lead from one to another in a defined order. There are an immense number of outcomes down either path, therefore the question is difficult to answer decisively. And I suppose the possibilities are so many you could not hope to recite them all here, now. Correct, though I can tell you one thing with certainty. Despite himself, Trem looked up in curiosity and waited. If you remain in Silverleaf, if you never leave, then the world will end with you there, collapsing all around you, and all of it that you have and have not seen will cease to exist, forever. Trem seemed unfazed. The world has to end, doesn't it? And I do not appear to be in danger of dying of old age. The world will end sooner if you remain. That sounds like a threat, Trem grated, once again crossing his arms and squaring his shoulders. I know that you gave me this gift of yours for some misguided reason, because you thought I would stand against evil or some foolish notion. Well, I tried that, didn't I? Tried and failed more than once. Why should I venture forth and do so again? No one is asking you to fight against evil, Trem. Good and evil are childish concepts. Trem's eyes narrowed as the words echoed in his mind. You sound like someone else, I remember. That was not my intention. Fine. You told me what happens if I stay. You mean if I leave, it somehow prevents the end of the world? No. Trem threw up his hands in exasperation. Then what does it matter? How is any of this helping me, or you, or anyone? Your leaving is not enough. As I said, there are many possible outcomes tied to choices you and any number of others, mortal and immortal, will make. All I have told you is that if you remain, if you stay hidden and withdrawn from the world, it will wilt, wither, and fall to nothing. And if I leave now, that might not happen. If you leave at all, the possibility of Tethtanir continuing on for a great while longer exists, yes, though it might be wise to leave with someone else and not on your own. Coercion, Trem muttered. For a god lacking in knowledge of mortal social graces, you seem very adept at manipulating behavior. I am only expressing something that I believe to be true. Your leaving with Jovaneleth will undoubtedly be better for you, with a companion to assist you for at least a portion of your journey. And is there no part of you that is intrigued by his undertaking? It seems the search for a lost parent would be of personal interest to you. I gave up that search long ago, Trem said quietly, and I am almost certain I know his father. I met him before. Indeed? Yes, and the connection does interest me, though not in the way that you might think. It makes me wonder who's pulling the strings, who sent him here to be found by me. Was it you, Curvin, or Alanormir, or Naroth? It could be any number of minor gods interfering with my life once again. You say you cannot intervene directly, but you immortals always seem to find an avenue to worm your way into it regardless. You may be right. One of my kin may have arranged these events, but it was not I, and, despite what you are not excluded from the possibility of coincidence. And no matter how or why he came to you, it was your choice to help him. I wonder why that sense of duty has such limits that you just see him off, alone and injured, into a land you know is rife with danger. Trem put his hand to his brow and replied, Once again, Curvin, you seem far more adept at playing games with my mind than you let on. Enough of this. I'll make a choice when I wake. Go, and let me have dreams of my own making. Curvin did not respond, but faded from view. The universe of stars faded as well, and soon Trem floated only in blackness. The empty space was unnerving, and he quickly refocused on the cabin, the woods, and the familiar trappings of his home. Once he had recovered his control and was back in surroundings that soothed him, he released the dreamscape and allowed his weary mind to wander to whatever worlds it wished. Trem slept deeply and heavily, awash in the thoughts and wonder of his time in the dream world. Another break. Hey there, White. Alright, next section. Waking was a gradual process. Trem opened his eyes and slowly stirred a bit at a time on the ground outside his home. He felt sleepiness in his limbs and head, a groggy disconnect that lingered even as he tried to rouse himself. He listened, but did not hear Jovaneleth stirring within. Methodically, he got to his feet and walked to the rain barrel. Rather than douse his head, he scooped up water in his copper pot and walked to the fire pit. Tea would be the first thing he would need to clear his mind, and the process of brewing it would begin the piecing together of the night's travels. Like common dreams, those in the dreamscape often evade the awakened. Bits and pieces of them might still flit through the conscious mind, and those must be snatched and studied, so that the full scope of the meaning and the completeness of memory can be formed. It is a trying process and difficult when one is just awake, but also most easily accomplished when the dream is fresh. Trem watched the pot heat and went over to get his box of tea. As he sat down with it, he turned over in his mind the options before him, recalling the conversation with Curvin in increasing detail. What's the selection this morning? Trem nearly jumped at Jovan's voice. His thoughts had been so fixated on the task and his nighttime adventures. He looked up and saw the young man standing over his shoulder, smiling full and refreshed, and shrugged. I had not decided. You can choose if you like. Oh no, Jovan sat beside Trem. I know nothing about tea. You should choose. Without further discussion, Trem selected a hearty, earthy red tea and accepted the clay pot from Jovaneleth, who had carried it out from the cabin with him. As the aroma of the leaves rose into the air, Trem breathed deeply and sighed. He felt a bit clear-headed now and refreshed despite the strain of the evening's activities. Trem passed Jovan his cup and scanned his appearance. He was dressed for travel, his armor back on over his earthen-colored tunic and his boots strapped and ready for marching. Trem knew what he had to ask, but also felt he had to explain himself first. Jovan, he said in a soft tone, I must admit I've not been entirely honest with you." Javaneleth did not answer. Sipping his tea, he watched Trem over the top of his cup and waited. Trem cleared his throat, and then out it came. "I knew your father." Joven's eyes widened enormously, and he straightened, though he managed to refrain from standing. "When? How?" Trem sighed. "His name is Jonathan Blade, yes?" All it took was one look at Joven's face to confirm Trem was correct. "He was the captain of the unit I fought for in the War of the Lion, as a volunteer for the Eagle Knights." Javaneleth seemed confused. "But that was almost 13 years ago, and you're maybe 25 summers at most. You would have been a child." Trem's face showed he had not considered the mathematics of his past as it related to his appearance and unique condition. Fortunately, Joven took this as an expression of pain and memory rather than a desperate mind racing to formulate the appropriate lie. "You must have been a page or squire of some kind, then." "Yes." Trem was grateful for the assistance in his deception. "I was named a sword, but did rather little fighting. I doubt your father would remember me." Javaneleth nodded in agreement. He spoke quite rarely of that time. I think it was very difficult on him. "Yes, it was difficult for us all. But why did you keep this from me, Trem?" Trem sat up and set his cup down before continuing. "I was not sure at first that it was the same man, but over time the things you told me made it impossible that it could be anyone else. I never knew he had a wife or son. I left the Knights soon after the battle on the hills outside Aves. It was a bloody, terrible affair, and I had no desire to remain. I came here shortly after that, seeking refuge from the brutality of the world I'd been a part of. Your father was good to me, good to all the other non-humans as well. He never showed a fleck of prejudice towards any of us. I saw he trusted his soldiers regardless of who or what they were. What you have told me of your home and his efforts does not surprise me. It sounds like the same man I knew." "He has always been a forgiving man," Javaneleth agreed, "and he was never quick to judge anyone by their appearance or demeanor. He was once a marauding pirate, now turned king and ruler of a city that strives for equality and understanding. I think that's what made him so willing to believe in the redeeming qualities of others." "So you plan to continue looking for him?" "Yes." Javaneleth's face was determined. "I cannot rest until I learn what's become of him." "Very well." Trem stood and tried to array himself in a military stance before his guest, examining him. "You seem fit enough to travel." He paused and placed a hand awkwardly on Joven's shoulder. "If you will have me, I wish to accompany you." Javaneleth was taken aback by the offer. "But why? You've done more than enough for me already, and you seem to enjoy your privacy. Simply because you once knew my father when you were young?" Trem moved his hand and looked back towards his home. "I have lost both of my parents. In truth, I lost them some time ago. I sympathize with your plight, Javaneleth, and I also fear that if I lead you down to the road north, I will simply have delayed your death. Wandering into the dust plains alone and injured gives you little chance, no matter your bravery or determination." "I can make it," Joven said defiantly, "but perhaps it will be more difficult than I expect. Still, I know you're a gifted hunter and survivor, Trem, but what of combat? War? How much training could you have received at so young an age? And how much of it has your body forgotten?" Trem shrugged. "The only way to know is to test myself. Regardless, my eyes and ears will be of great use, perhaps enough to avoid fighting altogether." He turned his eyes back on Joven. "I ask again, will you have me?" Javaneleth paused, hand on his chin, considering. Then he smiled and nodded firmly. "I will, Trem. Thank you." The hermit seemed neither pleased nor unhappy with the answer, but almost consigned to it. "Gather your things, then. I have to retrieve my own gear." Joven did not argue. He went to the door of the cabin and retrieved his pack and warm wool cloak, tossing it over one shoulder as it was still rather warm. Beside the doorway, he checked the release of his scabbard and strapped the heavy broadsword his father had given him to his back. The additional weight was noticeable but not overwhelming. Testing his feet once again, he found he felt able to move more steadily than before with his items returned to him. Feeling fully prepared, he turned to look for his fellow traveler. Trem was bowed over a spit, roasting the rabbits and cutting up slices of salted venison for the journey. "Watch these. I won't be a moment." Joven complied, kneeling to turn the spit slowly and mentally calculating the number of days they had meat supplies for. Trem entered his home and walked to the bedroom. Removing a long, squat chest from under the bed, he eased it open with an ominous creak. He flinched as if struck when he saw the torn and faded blue tunic, but he recovered quickly and made himself rummage through the items beneath it. First, he reached in to pull out a sword, barely squeezed into the trunk diagonally from behind the folds of cloth. A battered and scuffed scabbard of a longsword rested in his palms for a while as he took the time to study every inch and absorb every unnerving, disquieting thought it brought to him. Calm at last, he set the blade aside and continued his search. He pulled out a thin but finely made leather shirt, which he put on immediately over his green tunic. He then removed a light, long-armed suit of chainmail and draped it over his body. The added weight felt abnormal, but he knew it would take him only a short while to adjust. After another brief inspection of the other odds and ends, he slammed the chest shut and went back to his empty room to grab some spare traveling clothes and a worn knapsack. Trem swept out of the house, closing the door softly behind him. He was clad in the thin and lightweight chainmail over the brown leather bodkin. He wore his usual lightly tanned high boots of deerskin and had strapped on a wide belt for his water flask and sword. On his back was strapped a small pack of provisions with his unstrung bow, both mostly obscured by a long and heavy hooded forest cloak. The cloak stretched down to his ankles, and as he approached Joven it blew back slightly to reveal the longsword riding easily at his hip. Joven stared at him wide-eyed, and Trim anticipated the question on his mind. As I said, I found many items of all kinds in my time here. Adjusting his belt and cloak, Trim paused outside and turned. He studied his home, the haven from the world he was preparing to return to. He thought about how easy it would be to change his mind and go back. As he studied the downtrodden abode, he wondered if he was making the right choice. He glanced over his shoulder at Jovaneleth, waiting patiently with his tousled dark hair, and steeled himself. Looking back once more to give a last farewell to his home, he turned and said simply, "Let's go." Joven did not argue. He followed the shrouded figure out of his small clearing in the forest. Neither man would ever see the cabin again. They traveled quickly for the first few hours of early morning. The first several miles of the journey were spent in silence, moving through the thicket of Silverleaf's trees. Trem did not speak out of choice, and Jovaneleth because he was struggling to keep an eye on his guide, whose shifting cloak was difficult to follow in the shady green of the forest. Trem's pace was deliberate but quick, finding small animal trails that made the going easier. Around midday, they emerged from the woods onto Old South Ron Road. Trem stopped here and turned to address his companion. This is about 4 hours' march from what used to be called the Plains Way, which was, I believe, the southern road leading to Guylakill. We are further south than you were when your party was attacked, and if we continue to follow this road south, we will reach the Plains Way by early evening. I suggest we continue an hour north toward Guylakill from there, and then camp so as to avoid being caught at a crossroads. Joven agreed. The plan was good and would hopefully avoid any confrontation with other travelers. They continued without another word, Trem passing back nuts, berries, and some roast meat to serve as their marching lunch. The road wound lazily south and was wide and easy to travel. Jovaneleth lost track of time, and soon they arrived at the old crossroad that had once served as the main way connecting the continents of South Ron and Lagotia. In the years before the assault on Aves, this road had been the main artery of trade between the two lands. These days, the Plains Way remained little more than a thin trace of a trail just wide enough for one man on foot. Trem did not pause, but followed the faded tracks marking the road rolling north to Guylakill. Joven hurried to follow, focused on the last hour of their hike, beginning to feel the wear in his somewhat untested legs. Normally he would not have been tired, but his time in bed had drained some of his old strength. It would return in time, though, and until then it was bearable. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other with a stoic, deliberate stride, unwilling to slow their progress or appear weak in front of his partner. His muscles burned and his side ached, but Joven was also invigorated by finally being back on the hunt for his father. Trem stopped an hour later, as promised, and announced he would find a suitable campsite several feet into the woods and off the road. Once a feasible location had been chosen, Joven followed and sat down thankfully between the large roots of an old tree as Trem took out 2 thin bedrolls he had thoughtfully packed. Joven thanked him for his as Trem passed it over. After spreading their bedding out, Trem dug into the pack and pulled out some hard but still edible bread and more dried meat. "Sorry there's not much else that will last very long out here," he remarked. Jovaneleth accepted his share gratefully and leaned against the oak to eat. He watched his traveling partner as he did. Trem ate slowly, as though considering each bite before taking it. He stared at the ground, or off into the trees, at things that only he appeared able to detect, or perhaps he was just deep in thought. Joven finally decided to ask the question he had been pondering since he had woken in the cabin. "What made you become a hermit, Trem?" The half-elf paused mid-bite, considering the question. "When the war ended, I decided I'd have enough violence in my life. I walked into Silverleaf Forest one day and simply never walked out." "But you chose to fight, volunteered, you said. And what made you change your mind so suddenly? After all, the knights won the war." The tone of Joven's inquiry was a touch demanding. "Our side won," Trem admitted, putting his food down. "We were able to repel the enemy and they scattered across the land. That does not mend severed limbs or take away the guilt of having ended another's life. I was done with all of it, so I simply removed myself from the rest of the world." Joven seemed to accept the answer in part. "Why help me now, then?" Trem picked up a piece of meat and chewed slowly. "Your father was a good man, and I feel I owe him and his family some measure of loyalty." "It's appreciated." "Tell me," Trem said, wiping his hands on his breeches, "why did your father leave Bladeholm? Do we have any idea where he might be?" Jovaneleth leaned forward, his eyes searching the ground before him. "Some years ago another invasion began. Even if you had been outside of Silverleaf, it's likely you would not have heard of it. A large army did the unthinkable, crossing the frozen reach and sweeping down through the Napoleon Empire, sacking her towns as they went. The High Thane of Nepal City and the houses loyal to him put up a valiant defense, but the most trusted man in their ranks betrayed them all. The city gates were opened for the invaders when they reached the capital, and the massacre was reportedly horrible. Now the lands north of the God's Bones Mountains are ruled by the invaders. Their leader apparently goes by the name of Wolfbane. Wolfbane? That's an odd name. Yes, apparently it's a title he gave himself. He's from the west, as is most of his army. Massively strong man, the rumors say, wielding a great axe in battle. His army and followers call themselves Narathians, and say they serve the will of the god of death, to conquer and claim all the lands and unite all mortals under one banner. It's said Wolfbane believes he's doing a great service for the people of our world, but the methods of those loyal to him are wretched, and those are just the actions we've been able to confirm. So what does this have to do with your father? Joven sighed and rubbed his head. You have to understand, and maybe you remember from when you knew him, my father's not someone who delegates responsibility, even less so when it involves great personal danger. When he began to hear rumors of torture, dark magic, and a great fortress in the east that had pinned the nation of Angladeus within their valley homeland, he became gravely concerned. Wolfbane has also made it no secret he will not stop at ruling Nepal. He means to take over all the lands of Lagosha, including ours. Worse, when Thane Greymane Squall committed the foul single act of treachery by betraying his High Thane at the capital and let the enemy in, other houses worked long behind the scenes to help the invaders emerge victorious. There are elements in Nepal that want Wolfbane in command, who are willing to throw their support behind him in Narath in the hopes it will bring them power and wealth. All of this suggested our homeland, so young and hopeful, was in danger. So your father went to see this threat for himself. Was he kidnapped? Joven shook his head. No, he did not go as an ambassador or member of our order. He was going as a spy. But as the ruler of Bladeholm and a prominent figure in the War of the Lion, he couldn't expect to be unrecognized, even in the north. Trem's expression was puzzled and a bit incredulous at the foolishness of Jonathan Blade. He had to know they would seize him once he was through the Wind Pass. Joven smiled slyly. My father has many gifts from his pirating days, disguise and deception among them. He also had the help of my mother, who has some skill in the arcane. He was protected, and we never received word of his capture or death. If the Narathians and this Wolfbane had found him, they would have made it known. As it stands, his last communication was a letter sent by carrier pigeon from Osmandius, over 6 months ago. Trem understood at last. A long time, and even in the north and disguised, he should have been able to send a note of some sort. Yes, Joven said quietly. That's why we need to go to Gailakill first. I need to know if he made it north at all, or if he was met upon the road and taken, or worse. Trem did not respond, unsure of what to say. He would have liked to reassure his new friend, but it was not in his nature to do so. Instead, he returned to the uneaten rations to his pack and said stiffly, We have a long day ahead of us tomorrow. You should get some rest. Without another word, he rolled over and covered himself in the thick cloth of his cloak against the chill of the early fall evening. Joven sighed and removed his own belt and boots. Rolling over onto his mat, he could not help feeling frustrated. He'd begun to like Trem, at least in most respects, but his apparent discomfort with discussing the realities of the world in plain terms grated at times. Perhaps it was a byproduct of his time away from others and his decision to follow that path at such a young age. As Joven lay down, he wondered how long Trem would truly stay by his side. It seemed that their chance encounter had driven his fellow half-elf from his state of self-imposed sequestering in the forest, but Joveneleth drifted off to sleep unsure if he could even expect to find Trem with him in the morning. Quick scene change. The rat scurried rapidly across the room, careful to stay under the shadows of the looming furniture about it. It had learned from the mistakes of its previous brethren that only in the darkness were they safe, and rarely at that. Pausing to sniff at the air, it detected the rank odor of something near death, already partially rotted. This was surely to be its meal for the night, and whatever it was lay just a bit further down the tunnel. Dashing quickly along the blackened wall, the rat followed the corridor until it reached the barred room at the end of the hall. Here it could smell the food, but it also detected something else, something dark and cold. Looking carefully into the light, the rat saw a figure cloaked in a black shroud of cloth. The man-like form was tall and thin, with a sense of power, chill, and most of all, death emanating from it. This was the source other than the food, the one blocking it. Patience would give the rat its chance. Once this hulking form left, it would be free to feast. The Dark One spoke from the glow of the torch in his hand. His voice had a bizarre and twisted echo like that of wind from some deep crevice. Whenever he spoke, a slight crackling came underneath his words, like snapping parchment in the air. Why do you continue to evade me? Your friend has forsaken you. Protecting him is pointless. Give me his location, and I will kill you quickly before the rats eat you alive. From deep within the chamber came a second, futile voice of another man, sounding alone and forlorn. His speech was slurred as though he spoke around an obstruction, or perhaps his lips were somehow stuck together. Never, you fiend. I'll never give you what you want. The dark figure sighed and shook his head. Still you insist on being foolish, even after he betrayed you, and your whole miserable city. Stop shielding him. Tell me what you know. Greymane was tricked, lied to. Your blind stupidity and pointless resistance bores me. I can find him through many other methods. Very well, the rats may have you. With that, the shadowy mass swept out of the room, slamming the steel door behind him. As he walked down the hall, he flicked his wrist in the cell lock's direction, and it clicked into place. Swiftly he moved along, and was soon around the corner and out of sight. The rat stirred itself and hurried forward, leaping between the cracks of the cell bars. The meal squirmed as the brood closed in. The rat could feel more of its kin writhing alongside it. Hopefully, there would be enough for everyone. Okay. So that's chapter 2. I needed a quick water. Whew. So, I'm not sure who else is in the chat. I know White's here. If anybody has questions or thoughts or anything that they want to ask, I'm going to talk for a minute and I'll answer anything that pops up. I have begun the process of uploading things to YouTube. The first episode should be up. I'm going to test them and make sure they work, and then I will download not only this episode, but also the second one, and I'll make sure that those get up on YouTube too, and then I will link the channel in the chat, and if you want to be able to catch them on YouTube, or if you come into this later and you missed some of the earlier sections, you can go back and catch them there. So, YouTube for posterity. Yeah, YouTube is, that's how we're going to get famous. So, coming up on the third chapter, the story is going to start to branch out a little bit, and the bigger picture stuff is going to start to become a little more apparent, but again, it's still relatively slow going. The general setup of the first couple chapters is entirely intended to build a relationship and background on Trem and Joven, and also to introduce you to a couple elements like the dreamscape. You know, the idea that the world of dreams exists between the world the mortals live in and the world the gods live in, and shares qualities of them both, and sort of acts as like a limbo state between those two things, which can be both good and bad for anyone who's using it. So that's pretty much all I've got today. You can find the books on Amazon if you search for the Legacy Chronicle. The Sword and the Shield are both available now. I've actually put in, I want to say, close to 15,000 words worth of writing for book 3 today and 2 days ago, in between watching the World Cup. And if you want to follow me on at Legacy Chronicle Twitter, you can. That's at Legacy Chronicle on Twitter. Although during the day you're going to get mostly World Cup commentary and updates, so just be prepared for that because I love soccer and this is a great tournament. Other than that, not much. The Let's Play or TH Paul Plays will still be going on during the week. I played Dragon Spear for a while yesterday. I will probably pick that up again either Tuesday or definitely Thursday. And I have been playing Bloodborne, just not on stream. And it's possible I'm going to actually get on in a little bit and do that too on stream for a while. I don't know. I haven't totally sorted out what I'm doing yet. So thanks for watching. Thanks for catching up. And I will hopefully see everybody back on Monday for Chapter 3.